Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was a legend. By 1942, his name struck fear into the hearts of Allied commanders across North Africa. He had defied expectations. With limited resources, he had repeatedly outmaneuvered and outfought the British, forcing them back across the desert. Rommel's strategy was built on speed, deception, and audacious thrusts. He understood desert warfare better than anyone. He knew how to use the terrain, how to concentrate his forces, and how to strike at the enemy's weak points. His Afrika Korps, though often outnumbered, compensated with superior tactics, better tanks, like the early Panzer IIIs and IVs, and the devastating 88mm anti-aircraft gun, repurposed as an anti-tank killer. As 1942 drew to a close, Rommel faced a new, terrifying threat. Operation Torch. On November 8, 1942, American and British forces landed in French North Africa, Morocco and Algeria. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history at that point. Rommel, already fighting a desperate battle against Montgomery's British Eighth Army in Libya and Egypt, suddenly found himself caught between two Allied forces. His immediate concern was the British. They were the seasoned veterans of the desert, relentless and well-supplied. The Americans, however, were an unknown quantity. Rommel looked at the maps. He saw the vast distances, the rugged Atlas Mountains, the poor infrastructure. He quickly formulated a new strategy: hit the Americans hard, destroy their will to fight, and secure his western flank. He believed the Americans were soft. He believed they were inexperienced. He thought he could crush them quickly, push them back to the sea, and then turn his full attention back to the British. This wasn't just battlefield tactics, it was a grand strategic gamble. If he could deliver a decisive defeat to the Americans, it might even shake their political will back home. He dismissed them as a logistical army, too reliant on their machines. He believed their soldiers lacked the toughness of the Germans or the British. Rommel planned a bold offensive through the Kasserine Pass. He would use his veteran panzer divisions, including elements of the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, supported by Italian units. His goal was to punch through the American lines, seize the supply dumps at Tibessa, and cut off the Allied forces in Tunisia from their main supply lines. It was a brilliant plan, executed by a brilliant general. He had total confidence in his troops and his tanks. He believed the inexperienced Americans would break and run. He knew his forces were outnumbered overall, but he planned to achieve local superiority and deliver a knockout blow. The Desert Fox was about to pounce, and his target was the soft underbelly of the newly arrived American army. He was confident that the war in North Africa would be decided by skill and audacity, not by endless numbers. And he was about to learn a very painful lesson. In November 1942, the U.S. Army landed in North Africa, and they were, by and large, completely unprepared for modern warfare. For 2 decades, America had been an isolationist nation. Its army was small, poorly equipped, and largely untested since World War I. The troops that disembarked on the beaches of Morocco and Algeria were young, enthusiastic, but incredibly green. Many had never seen combat. Few had even seen a tank fire in anger. Their training had been rushed. They had been drilled on parade grounds and in training camps back home, but the reality of desert warfare was a harsh teacher. Their equipment, while plentiful, was not always suited for the specific conditions of North Africa. Their uniforms were often more suited for temperate climates than the scorching desert days and freezing desert nights. The American doctrine was focused on logistical power and overwhelming firepower, but the experience to effectively wield that power was simply not there yet. Their command structure was rigid and slow. Commanders, many of whom were veterans of the First World War, were not agile enough for the fluid, fast-paced tank battles Rommel excelled at. Communications were often unreliable. Radios failed in the desert heat. Units struggled to coordinate. When they first encountered the Germans and Italians, the Americans were often confused by the enemy's tactics. German discipline, experience, and the sheer shock of facing veteran panzer divisions for the first time were overwhelming. The American M for Sherman tank, while good by 1942 standards, was about to face the hardened crews of the Afrika Korps, and soon, the formidable Tiger I. The initial engagements were small skirmishes, but they highlighted the American shortcomings. They suffered heavy casualties. Their morale was shaken. They were learning the hard way, in the crucible of battle, the difference between theory and reality. Rommel's intelligence reports confirmed his bias. He saw American units that were poorly led, lacked tactical finesse, and broke easily under pressure. He saw columns of American trucks driving with their headlights on at night, broadcasting their positions. He saw commanders making basic errors, leaving their flanks exposed. He believed that the Americans were more interested in Hollywood than in real soldiering. He genuinely thought he could deal with them swiftly. This underestimation would prove to be one of the most significant strategic errors of his career. He saw their inexperience and their initial failures, but he failed to see their capacity for rapid adaptation and learning. He failed to grasp the depth of their industrial potential. He saw the initial trickle of American men and machines, but he didn't comprehend the immense tide that was gathering behind them. The Americans arrived in North Africa as naive amateurs. Rommel believed they would leave as defeated amateurs. But what they actually became was something far more dangerous, hardened professionals, backed by an unstoppable industrial machine. And Rommel, for all his genius, was about to become the instrument of their learning. February 1943. Kasserine Pass. This was the ultimate test for the fledgling U.S. Army, and they failed it spectacularly. Rommel's forces, a mix of German and Italian units, launched their offensive with a ferocity that caught the Americans completely by surprise. The battle unfolded as a series of tactical blunders and catastrophic defeats for the Americans. Their artillery was poorly positioned, often overrun by advancing German tanks. Their infantry was scattered and lacked communication. Their tanks, mostly M for Shermans, found themselves outmatched by the heavier German Panzer IVs and the terrifying 88mm guns mounted on mobile carriages. When the first Tiger I tanks finally appeared, the psychological impact was devastating. American 75mm shells simply bounced off the Tiger's thick frontal armor. The 88mm gun of the Tiger, however, tore through the Shermans with ease, often causing catastrophic explosions. American units broke and ran. The roads were choked with retreating trucks, fleeing infantry, and burning tanks. Thousands of American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces, and vehicles were abandoned or destroyed. It was a rout. A full-blown humiliation. Rommel was ecstatic. He had achieved precisely what he set out to do. He had delivered a crushing blow to the Americans. He had exposed their weaknesses. He pushed deep into the American rear, seizing critical supply dumps and threatening their entire logistical network. He famously described the Americans as an absolutely green army, adding that they had made all the tactical errors that one could possibly imagine. German newsreels showed footage of captured American equipment, endless lines of prisoners, and the smiling faces of triumphant German soldiers. The propaganda was clear: the Americans were a paper tiger. Their wealth and numbers meant nothing against German fighting spirit and tactical genius. The defeat sent shockwaves through the Allied command. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Allied commander-in-chief in North Africa, was furious. He realized the severity of the problems: poor leadership, lack of training, and a fundamental failure to understand combined arms warfare. He brought in General George S. Patton, a notoriously aggressive and demanding leader, to shake up the demoralized II Corps. Patton arrived like a whirlwind, instilling harsh discipline, firing incompetent officers, and demanding immediate improvements in training and tactics. Kasserine Pass was a brutal, bloody lesson. It exposed every flaw in the American military structure. But it also served as a catalyst. It forced the Americans to confront their shortcomings head-on. It forced them to learn, and to learn fast, in the face of a formidable enemy. Rommel saw only the defeat. He saw the broken army. He didn't see the underlying strength, the industrial capacity, or the incredible adaptability that would soon rise from the ashes of Kasserine Pass. He thought he had crushed them. But what he had actually done was something far more dangerous. He had awakened a sleeping giant and taught it how to fight. After the triumph at Kasserine Pass, Rommel was supremely confident. His reports to Berlin painted a picture of an easily defeated enemy. He wrote that the Americans still lack experience, their generals are inexperienced, and that their equipment is good, but the troops are poorly trained. He concluded that the Americans were an army that, while well supplied, was fundamentally lacking in the martial spirit and tactical prowess required for victory. This was Rommel's fatal miscalculation. He saw the snapshot of an inexperienced army, but he failed to grasp the potential of an industrial superpower. He judged the Americans by European standards of professionalism and military tradition, but the U.S. Army operated on an entirely different scale. Rommel's genius lay in rapid exploitation and audacious maneuvers with limited resources. He was a master of the coup de main. He assumed that if he delivered a decisive defeat, the Americans would falter, their logistical lines would collapse, and their morale would break. He was projecting his own logistical nightmares onto the Americans. Rommel's Afrika Korps was constantly starved of supplies, fuel, and replacement tanks. Every lost vehicle was a strategic blow. He assumed the Americans faced similar constraints. But the Americans didn't. Rommel saw a handful of burning Shermans at Kasserine and thought he had put a dent in their armored strength. He didn't understand that for every Sherman lost, there were 10 more being built back in the factories of Detroit and Lima. He saw a supply dump captured at Spatler and thought he had crippled their logistics. He didn't understand that the American industrial machine could replace that entire dump in a single week. His overconfidence led him to believe that the war was a game of chess, played by brilliant generals. He was a master chess player. But the Americans were playing a different game entirely. They were playing a game of poker, and they had an infinite supply of chips. Rommel underestimated the speed at which the American army could learn and adapt. He saw the initial confusion and believed it was a permanent state. He failed to account for the ruthless efficiency with which General Patton purged incompetence and instilled discipline. He failed to realize that American soldiers, once blooded, became incredibly tough and determined. And most importantly, he failed to comprehend the sheer, overwhelming, inexhaustible power of American industry and logistics. The U.S. was churning out thousands of tanks, millions of rounds of ammunition, and enough fuel to power an entire continent. This wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about winning a war of attrition on a global scale. Rommel, fighting with the last vestiges of a dying empire, simply couldn't compete with this. He thought he had delivered a knockout blow. But all he had done was provide a very expensive, very bloody, but ultimately invaluable training exercise for an army that was about to return with a vengeance. He thought he had won a battle. But in reality, he had just ensured he would lose the war. While Rommel was toasting his victory at Kasserine Pass with captured champagne, a very different scene was unfolding 4,000 miles away. In the industrial heartland of America, the sleeping giant wasn't just awake, it was working a double shift. Rommel's entire strategic worldview was shaped by the limitations of the German economy. In Germany, tanks were built like Swiss watches, handcrafted, meticulously engineered, and slow to produce. In America, tanks were being built like Fords. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant, managed by Chrysler, was the physical embodiment of Rommel's nightmare. It was a factory the size of a city. It had been designed by the architect Albert Kahn to be the most efficient manufacturing space on Earth. Inside, the air was filled with the deafening roar of riveting guns and the grinding of steel. There were no craftsmen here. There were assembly lines. Raw steel went in one end, and finished M for Sherman tanks rolled out the other. In 1942, while Rommel was begging Berlin for just a dozen more panzers to replace his losses, American factories produced 24,997 tanks. By 1943, that number would jump to 29,497. Think about those numbers. Rommel was fighting a war where the loss of 50 tanks was a catastrophe. The United States was building 50 tanks every single day. But it wasn't just tanks. It was everything. The Germans were chronically short of trucks. Their logistics still relied heavily on horses to pull artillery and supplies. The U.S. Army was fully motorized. General Motors, Ford, and Dodge stopped making civilian cars and devoted their entire capacity to the war effort. They produced the deuce-and-a-half truck, the CCKW. It was the backbone of the Allied advance. Rugged, reliable, and produced in the hundreds of thousands, these trucks meant that the American army could move faster and sustain itself longer than any army in history. And then there were the jeeps, the aircraft, the artillery shells, the rations. Rommel had assumed that the American defeat at Kasserine would dishearten the U.S. public. He believed that a democracy, soft from years of peace, would lose its will to fight. He was wrong. The news of the defeat didn't cause panic, it caused determination. The arsenal of democracy shifted into high gear. Women flooded into the factories, the famous Rosie the Riveters, taking the places of men who went to fight. They welded hulls, wired radios, and inspected ammunition. The efficiency was ruthless. German engineers were constantly tweaking their designs, adding improvements that slowed down production. American engineers froze the design. It doesn't have to be perfect, it has to be there. They prioritized standardization. A spark plug from a Jeep in the Pacific would fit a generator in North Africa. A track link from a Sherman built in Detroit would fit a Sherman built in Lima, Ohio. This interchangeability was a concept alien to the German military mindset, which valued individual excellence over systemic reliability. Rommel was fighting a war of tactics. The United States was fighting a war of production. As the smoke cleared over the battlefield at Kasserine, the first waves of this industrial tsunami were already being loaded onto ships. Rommel had defeated the vanguard. But he had no concept of the weight of the metal that was about to crash down upon him. Building the tanks was one thing. Getting them to the deserts of North Africa was another. This was the greatest logistical challenge in the history of warfare. Rommel struggled to get supplies across the Mediterranean Sea, a distance of a few hundred miles. The Americans had to cross the Atlantic Ocean, over 3,000 miles of hostile water. This was the domain of the U-boat. German submarines were hunting in wolf packs, sinking millions of tons of Allied shipping. Rommel counted on the U-boats to strangle the American supply line. He believed that the Atlantic was a barrier that could not be overcome. But the Americans treated the ocean not as a barrier, but as a highway. They built the Liberty ship. These were simple, ugly cargo ships. President Roosevelt famously called them dreadful-looking objects. But they were a miracle of mass production. Built from prefabricated sections welded together, a new technology that replaced slow riveting, a Liberty ship could be built in weeks. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. The Germans could sink them, yes. But they couldn't sink them faster than the Americans could launch them. It was a mathematical equation that the Germans could not solve. For every ship the U-boat sank, American shipyards launched 2 more. Inside these ships was the lifeblood of the army. Rommel's tanks often sat idle in the desert, their engines dry, waiting for a fuel tanker that had been sunk by the Royal Air Force. The American supply chain was a relentless conveyor belt. They brought everything. They brought millions of gallons of high-octane gasoline. They brought spare engines. They brought fresh tracks. They brought entire field hospitals. They brought ice cream machines. They brought mail from home. When an American tank broke down in the desert, the crew didn't abandon it. A maintenance company, equipped with specialized wrecker trucks and mobile machine shops, would drag it to the rear. They would pull a crate off a truck, rip open the packaging, and install a brand new engine that had been built in Michigan 3 weeks earlier. The tank would be back in the fight within 24 hours. Rommel, observing the battlefield through his binoculars, began to notice something terrifying. The American units he had destroyed at Kasserine were back. And they weren't just patched up. They were stronger. They had more tanks than before. They had more artillery. Their soldiers looked well fed. Their uniforms were new. It defied all German military logic. In the German experience, a battered division needed months to refit. The Americans did it in days. The sheer volume of stuff on the beaches of Algeria and Morocco was staggering. Miles of stacked crates. Pyramids of fuel drums. Parks of reserve vehicles stretching to the horizon. It was a logistical feat that made Rommel's supply struggles look amateurish. He had hoped to starve the Americans. Instead, he found himself facing an army that grew stronger every time he hit it. The Atlantic Ocean hadn't stopped them. It had merely acted as a pipeline for the greatest accumulation of material power the world had ever seen. Material superiority is useless without the will to use it. After Kasserine Pass, the American troops were demoralized. They felt outclassed by the Germans. They lacked discipline. They lacked aggression. General Eisenhower knew he needed a change. He needed a man who could take this mob of civilians and turn them into killers. He sent for George S. Patton. Patton arrived like a thunderstorm. He was flamboyant, profane, and utterly ruthless. He wore polished cavalry boots, a helmet lacquered to a shine, and ivory-handled revolvers on his hips. He didn't care if the men liked him. He wanted them to fear him more than they feared Rommel. His first orders weren't about tactics, they were about discipline. He ordered that all soldiers, from the front line to the rear echelon, must wear their helmets and leggings at all times. He fined officers who had unshaven faces or dirty uniforms. He closed the brothels. He imposed strict curfews. The soldiers hated it. They called it chicken's hit. But it worked. Patton understood psychology. By forcing the men to act like soldiers in the small things, he made them think like soldiers in the big things. He restored their pride. He told them, "We are going to kill these German bastards. We're not just going to shoot the sons of bitches, we're going to rip out their living goddamn guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks." But it wasn't just bluster. The Americans were analyzing their mistakes at Kasserine with cold objectivity. They realized their tank destroyer doctrine, keeping the tank destroyers in reserve, was flawed. They needed to integrate them. They realized their communications were too slow. They streamlined the radio networks. They realized they had been piecemealing their units, sending small groups of tanks against concentrated German armor. They adopted the German tactic of Schwerpunkt, concentration of force. They trained on the new M10 Wolverine tank destroyers, learning to use terrain to ambush the heavier Tigers. They drilled the artillery crews until they could drop a time-on-target barrage in minutes. The transformation was rapid. In the span of a few weeks, the two corps went from a broken, frightened unit to a disciplined fighting force. The naive optimism of 1942 was gone. It was replaced by a grim, professional determination. The soldiers stopped collecting souvenirs and started cleaning their rifles. They stopped looking at the war as an adventure and started looking at it as a job. Rommel, watching from his headquarters, sensed a change in the tempo of the American operations. The hesitant probes were gone. The radio chatter was more disciplined. The Americans were no longer retreating at the first sign of a panzer. They were holding their ground. They were patrolling aggressively. Patton had taken the raw clay of the American conscript and fired it in the kill of discipline. He had forged a weapon that was finally worthy of the massive industrial machine backing it. And he was itching to use it. Rommel had beaten the amateurs. Now, he was about to face the professionals. The rematch happened at El Geta in March 1943. This was the test. Had the Americans learned? Rommel had departed for Germany on sick leave, leaving General von Arnim in command, but the 10th Panzer Division, the veterans of Kasserine, was still the spearhead. The Germans planned a classic attack. They would punch through the American lines with a heavy armored wedge, supported by dive bombers. They expected the Americans to crumble just like before. The 10th Panzer Division rolled forward. Tanks in the lead, infantry in half-tracks following. But this time, the scene was different. The Americans didn't run. Patton had positioned his forces perfectly. He used the terrain. He placed his infantry on the ridges, digging them in deep. He placed his tank destroyers, the M10s with their powerful 3-inch guns, in hull-down positions, hidden in the wadis. And he massed his artillery. When the German tanks came into range, they didn't meet a panicked retreat. They met a wall of fire. The American artillery, coordinated by the new fire direction centers, dropped thousands of high-explosive shells on the German formation. It stripped away the German infantry, leaving the tanks exposed. Then, the M10 tank destroyers opened fire. The M10 was an open-topped, lightly armored vehicle, but its gun could kill a Panzer IV or a Tiger at reasonable ranges. The American crews fought with a cold fury. They maneuvered. They flanked. They used the shoot-and-scoot tactics they had practiced under Patton's glaring eye. The German attack stalled. The panzers tried to find a weak spot, but everywhere they turned, they faced disciplined fire. Mines disabled their tracks. Bazooka teams, hiding in foxholes, hit them from the sides. For the first time in the war, a full-strength German Panzer Division assaulted an American defensive line and was stopped cold. The Germans lost 30 tanks that day. It was a shock to the Wehrmacht. The green troops of Kasserine were gone. In their place were soldiers who stood their ground while tigers rumbled toward them. Patton watched the battle from a command post, observing the destruction of the German armor. He famously muttered, "Rommel, you magnificent bastard, I read your book." Though Rommel wasn't there personally, his tactics were being dismantled. The psychological victory was immense. The American soldier realized that the German Superman was a myth. The Panzer could be killed. The Stuka could be shot down. The Germans were just men, and they bled just like anyone else. Elgeta proved that the American army had matured. They had absorbed the painful lessons of Kasserine. They had combined their limitless supply of ammunition with newfound tactical competence. The Germans retreated, leaving their burning tanks in the desert. They were low on fuel. They were low on ammo. They were exhausted. The Americans, meanwhile, were just getting started. Behind the front lines at Elgeta, convoys of trucks were already bringing up fresh supplies for the next day's battle. The tide had turned. The Desert War was no longer a contest of maneuver. It was a contest of endurance. And in a contest of endurance, the American machine was unbeatable. By April 1943, the war in North Africa had shifted from a battle of maneuver to a battle of mathematics. And the math was entirely on the American side. Behind the front lines, the American logistical machine had reached full operating capacity. It was a sight that no European general had ever imagined. Supply dumps stretched for miles across the desert floor. There were mountains of sea ration crates. Pyramids of jerry cans filled with fuel. Acres of replacement tires. The Americans brought everything. They had mobile bakeries that baked fresh bread daily for the troops. They had mobile laundry units. They even had mobile ice cream plants to keep morale high in the sweltering heat. To the German soldier, living on stale bread, tinned sardines, and brackish water, the American abundance seemed like a fantasy. German prisoners captured during skirmishes were often stunned by the contents of an American pockets. They found packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes, chocolate bars, and chewing gum. They realized that the American private was living better than a German colonel. But the most terrifying aspect for the Germans wasn't the luxury, it was the redundancy. If an American tank threw a track, they didn't just fix it, they had a replacement track ready. If a truck engine blew, they didn't scrap the truck, they dropped in a new crate engine. The supply chain was a relentless, unceasing river of material flowing from the Liberty ships at the ports to the foxholes at the front. The Red Ball Express, the famous truck convoy system in Europe, had its origins here in the desert. Drivers pushed their trucks 24 hours a day, ignoring speed limits and maintenance schedules, just to keep the supplies moving. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built airfields in days. They laid pipelines for fuel so that trucks didn't have to carry it all. They built railroads where none existed. Rommel had based his strategy on the assumption that the Americans would run out of steam. He assumed that the long supply lines across the Atlantic would act as a bottleneck. He was wrong. The Atlantic was a pipeline. The sheer weight of metal arriving in Tunisia meant that Allied commanders could afford to be wasteful. They could fire artillery barrages that lasted for hours, churning up the desert floor, just to kill a single machine gun nest. They could risk tanks in aggressive reconnaissance because they knew there were more tanks waiting in the reserve pool. This material superiority changed the psychology of the American commander. He no longer had to worry about conserving his strength. He could apply constant, grinding pressure. He could attack at dawn, at noon, and at dusk. The Americans were not winning because they were brilliant tacticians. They were winning because they were relentless. They were bludgeoning the Afrika Korps to death with a sledgehammer made of gold. The German officers looked at their own dwindling supplies and realized the bitter truth: bravery cannot stop a glacier. And the American glacier was sliding inexorably toward Tunis. While the Americans were swimming in supplies, the Afrika Korps was dying of thirst. The German squeeze had begun. Rommel's supply lines were being strangled. The Royal Navy and the Allied Air Forces had established a blockade across the Mediterranean. Operation Flax was launched, a brutal air campaign designed to cut off the German air transport fleet. German transport planes, the Ju-52s, were desperate to fly in fuel and ammo to the trapped forces in Tunisia. They were slaughtered. Swarms of American P-38 Lightnings and British Spitfires intercepted the slow, lumbering German transports. In one day alone, that Palm Sunday massacre, dozens of German planes were shot down into the sea. Rommel's tanks began to run dry. A Tiger tank is a formidable weapon, but without fuel, it is just a 60-ton steel bunker. German crews were forced to siphon fuel from destroyed trucks just to move their tanks into firing positions. They were reduced to firing a few shells a day. The famed 88mm guns, the terror of the desert, fell silent because there were no shells to feed them. Rommel himself was sick. Physically exhausted and suffering from desert sores and illness, he was recalled to Germany in March 1943. He left a doomed army behind. General von Arnim took command, but he was commanding a ghost. The German soldiers were exhausted. They had been fighting without rest for months. Their uniforms were tattered. Their boots were falling apart. They looked at the American lines and saw a mirror image of their own despair. They saw fresh troops rotating in. They saw endless columns of vehicles. The tactical brilliance of the German army was rendered useless. You cannot maneuver if your trucks have no gas. You cannot blitzkrieg if your tanks have no tracks. The Germans were forced into a static defense, digging into the rugged hills around Tunis. They fought with the desperation of trapped rats. They used every trick they knew. They laid minefields. They set booby traps. But they knew the end was coming. Reports from the German front lines were filled with a sense of doom. "The enemy has infinite ammunition," one officer wrote. "We count every round." The Americans were learning to exploit this weakness. They would launch feint attacks, forcing the Germans to move their tanks to react. This burned up precious fuel. Then, the Americans would attack somewhere else. It was a strategy of exhaustion. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered Europe on the back of speed and logistics, was now being strangled by the very thing they had neglected. They were starving in a desert, watching their enemy feast. The squeeze was tight, and the Allies were turning the screw every single day. May 1943. The end game. The Allies launched their final offensive to push the Axis forces into the sea. It was a multinational hammer blow. The British First Army attacked from the north. The British Eighth Army attacked from the south. The US II Corps, now a hardened, professional force, attacked in the center towards Bizerte. The Germans crumbled. Their defensive lines, starved of supplies and pounded by artillery, simply disintegrated. On May 7, Allied tanks rolled into Tunis and Bizerte. The scenes that followed were unprecedented in the history of the war. The Germans didn't fight to the last bullet. They couldn't. They had no bullets left. They surrendered en masse. It was a collapse of staggering proportions. Over 230,000 Axis soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. To put that in perspective, that is more prisoners than the Russians took at Stalingrad. Miles of German and Italian soldiers marched into captivity. They walked past the American tanks they had mocked just a few months earlier. They saw the M for Shermans, the M10 tank destroyers, the endless lines of trucks. The myth of the Afrika Korps ended not with a bang, but with a shuffle of dusty boots. General von Arnim surrendered the Afrika Korps. He refused to shake hands with the Allied commanders, maintaining a stiff Prussian arrogance to the end. But his army was gone. The Mediterranean was now an Allied lake. The threat to the Suez Canal was over. For the Americans, the victory was sweet. They had entered the war as amateurs. They had been blooded, beaten, and humiliated at Kasserine. But they had gotten back up. They had fixed their leadership. They had fixed their tactics. And they had brought the full weight of their industrial power to bear. The soldiers of the II Corps stood in the streets of Bizerte, dusty, tired, but victorious. They looked at the wreckage of the German army, the burnt-out tigers, the abandoned 88s. They realized that the German Superman was a lie. They had met the best the Wehrmacht had to offer, and they had beaten them. The victory in North Africa was the turning point for the Western Allies. It proved that the alliance could work. It proved that the American army was ready for the big leagues. The road to Berlin didn't start on the beaches of Normandy. It started in the sands of Tunisia. It started when the US Army decided that getting beaten wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of the lesson. The North African campaign changed the way the United States fought wars forever. It established a doctrine that would define American military power for the next century. The doctrine of logistics is destiny. Before Kasserine, there was a romantic notion of war, of gallant charges and individual heroism. After Tunisia, war was a business. It was about production schedules, shipping tonnage, and fuel consumption. The US Army realized that they didn't need to be better at man-to-man combat than the Germans, though they often were. They just needed to overwhelm them. If the Germans built a Tiger tank that was better than a Sherman, the Americans wouldn't spend years trying to build a better Tiger. They would just build 5 Shermans for every Tiger. They would drown the enemy in steel. This philosophy, the American way of war, was forged in the desert. It relied on firepower to save lives. Why send an infantry platoon to storm a hill when you can flatten the hill with artillery? Why risk a tank duel when you can call in an airstrike? This approach was expensive in dollars, but cheap in blood. And for a democracy, that was the only way to fight. Rommel's legacy is one of tactical brilliance but strategic blindness. He was a master of the battle, but he didn't understand the war. He didn't understand that modern war is not won by the general on the hill, it is won by the factory manager in Detroit and the supply clerk in the depot. The Kasserine Pass was the tuition fee the United States paid to learn modern warfare. It was expensive. It cost thousands of lives. But the return on that investment was the liberation of Europe. The commanders who cut their teeth in North Africa, Patton, Bradley, Eisenhower, went on to lead the invasion of Sicily, Italy, and France. They carried the lessons of the desert with them. They knew never to underestimate the enemy. They knew the value of discipline. But above all, they knew the power of the supply line. Today, when we see the US military deploy anywhere in the world, we see the echo of 1943. We see massive transport planes, prepositioned ships, and a logistical tail that stretches around the globe. It is a machine designed to ensure that an American soldier never has to fight a fair fight. He will always have more ammo, more fuel, and more support than his enemy. That is the legacy of the desert. Rommel thought he had crushed the American spirit. Instead, he forged it into a weapon that would destroy the Third Reich. The Desert Fox was outfoxed not by a better maneuver, but by a better system. And that system, born in the humiliation of Kasserine, became the blueprint for victory.